It is pretty widely felt here by professionals and others that the war has virtually been won.
1967 is one of the wondrous dates in Israeli history.
The straggle of newsmen went in. As one looked, one could only feel that, as before, surrender would deepen Arab hatred for the Jews.
As long as they have the best lands, they've taken the lands, they've confined the Palestinians into small areas, there cannot be good neighborly relations. And there aren't any good neighborly relations.
The whole country was drunk on victory. And you could describe the arc of Israeli politics since then as a process of sobering up at different speeds.
The myth of 1967 is that the Israeli David beat the Arab Goliath. In fact, Israeli generals and Britain and America were confident that Israel would beat all its Arab enemies in short order, and they were right. The Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser started the slide to war with a series of blunders and gambles. But Israel made victory certain on the first day, 5th of June, with a surprise attack that destroyed the Arab air forces on the ground. By the third day, they were capturing the walled old city of Jerusalem. When Israeli troops came up this hill, there was very little resistance left in the old city. Israel had a quick and decisive victory. But the legacy of the war changed the shape of the Arab-Israeli conflict, made it worse, and 40 years on, still dominates life here. The war deepened the Middle East refugee problems. It made Israel into an occupier. It pushed Palestinians, rather than the beaten states of 1967, into the front line against Israel. If you want to understand today's conflict, you have to understand what happened then. Victory sent a huge surge of relief through Israelis. After the Wailing Wall was captured, many Israelis wept.
The most famous picture of all is one that I showed some of you yesterday, right, which is of the paratroopers, young kids.
Something every Israeli guide in Jerusalem these days remembers.
And they cried, and there's a very famous poem.
The man who took the picture he's holding cried with relief too.
One of the three soldiers. Yeah. Oh, I have to look for that again.
He's the Israeli photographer, David Rubinger.
When you're doomed and condemned to death, and suddenly somebody creates a miracle like that war, 6 days, and you're not only, you have saved yourself, but you're now Lord of the world, King of the world. That feeling in many people translated into some messianic feeling. In other words, that is not a victory man-made, that's God-made.
Jerusalem's unique religious and political charge comes from its holy places. The Golden Dome over there is part of the third holiest place in the world for Muslims, and the Wall is the holiest place in the world where Jews can pray. The conflict is at its sharpest in Jerusalem, not just because the city is holy to three faiths, Christians as well as Muslims and Jews, but because for Palestinians and for Israelis, Jerusalem is a national symbol. In 1967, relief and elation touched off national and religious euphoria in Israel.
What will happen if, by any chance, by later agreement, you have to move out?
Never.
You're not going to move out?
No, I was born here.
I think it's one of the greatest things we've ever done.
1 minute, come on.
I was born 5 minutes from here, from the old city, and this was my dream for 20 years to see this place. And I think we will not give it back, never.
Every year, young Israeli religious nationalists parade through Jerusalem to commemorate 1967. Past Palestinians who live in the occupied east of the city. These marchers do not accept that they might have to let the Palestinians have a capital in Jerusalem too. But plenty of other Israelis believe that's part of the price of peace. So do Palestinians. Nazmi Jabeh, a Palestinian Jerusalemite, saw the Israelis arrive in the Old City in 1967.
All of that tradition of creating united Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, for the majority of Israelis, is nonsense. Now, mostly they mean by Jerusalem the Old City. They are not interested in the Arab neighborhoods to the north of the city. They are not interested in the Arab neighborhoods to the east of the Old City, but they are interested in the Old City. So why we do not go directly to negotiate the future of the Old City instead of continuing using the United Jerusalem as a slogan in the elections and in the daily propaganda? I mean, it is nonsense. It's just leading the city to more and more catastrophes and to more and more intifadas and uprisings.
After the war, the Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol's government annexed East Jerusalem plus a chunk of the West Bank. It decided secretly to return the Sinai to Egypt and the Golan to Syria if it could get peace deals. But the government couldn't agree on what to do with the rest of the West Bank, and 40 years on, it still can't. Israelis flocked to inspect the new territories. Some thought that keeping the West Bank would be a disastrous colonial enterprise. Others believed it was vital for Israel's future. That's still essentially the split in Israel. A few Israelis, motivated by nationalism or religion or both, decided to settle in the newly occupied territory to make sure that Jews would never have to leave. And from the very start, the Israeli state helped them, even though its own lawyers advised that settling civilians on occupied territory broke international law. The Israeli historian Gershon Gorenberg has seen the documents.
With the government incapable of making up its mind, with many of the main politicians uncertain themselves, those people who knew what they wanted and followed it up by going into the territories and starting settlements could count on the fact that the government wasn't going to stop them. And so they were able to, as the expression goes, create facts, put settlements in the territory, even when the government didn't want a settlement in a specific place. Over and over again, it failed to remove those people, and the settlements grew and became precisely the barrier that their founders wanted them to be to a pullout.
What effect does 40 years of being an occupier have on Israel?
If you looked at Israel the day after the war, the whole country was drunk on victory. And you could describe the arc of Israeli politics since then as a process of sobering up at different speeds. There were people who sobered up a week after the war and said, we can't hold this. There were people who sobered up a year or 2 years after the war and said, my gosh, we've got to start negotiating. There were people for whom it took 10 years, 20 years. There's people like Ehud Olmert, who in 2003, right, 36 years after the war, his entire life as a politician in a party that said that all the territories had to be held on to, and particularly the West Bank, suddenly announced, you know what? We can't hold on to this territory. So the process of getting over that ecstasy and recognizing that the realities were much more complex is really what's defined the political debate in Israel ever since.
Yeroham Katz was an Israeli paratrooper in 1967. He'd been born on a settlement called Kfar Etzion, deep in the West Bank. As a baby, he was evacuated not long before it fell in the 1948 war. Almost all its defenders, including his father, were killed. A few months after the 1967 war, Mr. Katz and his comrades, many of them also offspring of the original settlers, went back and stayed.
1967 is one of the wondrous dates in Israeli history. The land that is captured in the 67 is our land. It was an area, the Palestinians, which I don't know what nation are they from. When did they start being a nation? Are they a nation? It wasn't anybody's. But if they want peace, and we got this because of terrorism, because of war, like any other place in the world, when two countries are fight to the end to survive, the one that wins, they tell the weaker one what to do. But I don't see peace from the other side. That's the absurd of the people, because they suffer all what happens in their refugee camps. They bring it to themselves.
Tell me what we see around here.
We're in the north part of Ramallah.
Raja Shehada, a Palestinian writer, was 16 when Israel captured the West Bank. His latest book is about the way that Israel's settlement projects have altered the landscape around his home in Ramallah.
Every hilltop has a new Jewish settlement in a circle or a loop around Ramallah, going from Dolev to Talmon B. As long as they have the best lands, they've taken the lands, they've confined the Palestinians into small areas, there cannot be good neighborly relations. And there aren't any good neighborly relations.
At the moment, Israelis are separating themselves from Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem by building walls and fences and roads which act as barriers. They confine most Palestinians into enclaves centered on the main West Bank towns. Long term, the Israeli government worries that if it keeps all the occupied territories, it will end up being outnumbered by Palestinians in a single country. Some people believe Israel wants to avoid that by making the enclaves and Gaza into a rump Palestinian state, while it keeps the rest of the land. David Shearer, the head of the UN Humanitarian Affairs Office in Jerusalem, tracks the way that Israel is tightening its control of the West Bank.
Okay, so here's the West Bank. The yellow areas are the Palestinian areas under Oslo. That's the areas they control. And the white areas are actually under Israeli control. Now, if you put the settlements on top here, you notice the settlements, 450,000 settlers, increasing at 5.5% a year, which is 2 busloads of Israelis being added to the West Bank every day. Now, if you just look at the settlements and you put on the military bases, these are military areas that Israel reserves so that they are off limits for Palestinians. No Palestinian can go into a military area. Obviously, they're very close to the settlements as well. Now you take a look at the barrier. This is the West Bank wall and where it goes to. And Palestinians need a permit to enter any of these red areas because, again, most of the settlement population is actually living in those red areas. You can see that the West Bank's starting to get quite thin now, thinner for Palestinian movement. This shows the roads. No settlement in the West Bank can survive without a road linking it to Israel. It's sort of like the umbilical cord for a settlement. Now, Palestinians are restricted from using these roads. They either need a permit, they're not allowed to use them at all. In some cases, they can use them without a permit. Now, if you want to, we go back to that first map again and we put the Palestinian areas over the top, you can see that the Palestinian areas are fragmented, chopped up. So getting to a school, getting to a hospital, getting to work, getting to a market is all a real ordeal rather than something that we take for granted in our normal lives.
The war in 1967 left another legacy, more Arab refugees. A fortnight or so after the war was over, more than 400,000 Palestinians who'd been displaced by fighting and by the new occupation had crossed over the River Jordan from the West Bank to the East Bank. The vast majority of them thought it was only going to be temporary, that when things settled down, they'd be able to go home. But Israel has only ever allowed a handful of them back. And 40 years later, the right of return of Palestinian refugees is one of the biggest and most contentious issues in the Middle East. Around 4.5 million people who lost their homes in Middle East wars are now on the books of UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. About a third of them live in camps. This is Gaza camp in Jordan. These children are the grandchildren or even great-grandchildren of people who came from what became Israel in 1948 and were then forced to move again by war and occupation in 1967. The BBC brought the ice creams. In Syria, Hamid al-Halabi is a refugee from the Golan Heights. Part of his family is still there, on the other side of the wire, living under the Israeli occupation.
أسامة راح أسامة سلمونا عليك كثير السلام سلموا عليك كثير السلام.
He uses a loudhailer across a stretch of minefields to make contact with them.
الحمد لله يا خي الحمد لله.
They've been separated since 1967 when, as a 20-year-old, he fled the fighting, along with more than 100,000 other Syrians. They call this place the Shouting Valley.
يا حمد.
Must be very frustrating.
Yes. That is agony on the humanitarian aspects.
Because you're so close.
So close, some 400 meters about, you see.
If you could walk now, how long would it take you to get home, to your home?
Some minutes I come. My sister's house here, my brother's house there. I can go to there, and if there is no any mines and fence and the frontiers, etc., you see.
الله يسلمك وانت سلم على نجية ولادي على غالب على كل اللي.
On the other side, below an Israeli watchtower, was his brother and one of his sisters. They had news of another sister who's in hospital. Once a year or so, they can all get to Jordan, but week to week, this is it. And the closest Hamid al-Halabi has been to his birthplace in 40 years. "20 minutes away is what's left of Quneitra, the regional capital of the Golan. It was handed back to Syria in ruins by Israel after the 1973 war, and left since then as a memorial. Israel has always said that the heights are vital for its defense, but it might be easier to make a deal over the Golan than in the West Bank. It almost happened in 2000. Back in Damascus, Syria's President Bashar al-Assad has just won another 7-year term with 97% of the vote. He was the only candidate. He said he wants more negotiations with Israel.
He's very serious, I guess. He's very serious, and as I said, also, I mean, it's very important to get Syria back to the Arab world. It's very important to establish good relations with the United States and with Europe. It's very important to lift the sanctions put on Syria by the United States, and it's a way also to sign the partnership agreement with the EU. I mean, you gain so much actually by concluding peace treaty with Israel and by regaining the Golan Heights for domestic and international reasons.
It's win-win for Assad.
It's win-win for Assad.
What if it's too late to unravel the legacy of 1967? After all, it's been 40 years. The world has changed. There's political Islam. That adds a whole extra dimension. And what if the Israelis have now settled so many people in the occupied territories that it might be impossible to create a viable Palestinian state? And what about the American invasion of Iraq, which is radiating out instability across the Middle East? Well, let's hope it's not too late, because unraveling the legacy of 1967 doesn't necessarily guarantee peace, but it's the best bet. And if there's a big enough international input led by the Americans and by the Saudis, it might even work. The alternative, leaving things as they are, as they've been over the last 40 years, is a guarantee of more violence and more misery for more generations. Gaza could be a vision of the West Bank's future, a power struggle between Palestinian factions, crippling Western financial sanctions, and crushing military pressure from Israel, which has no permanent military presence there, but legally is still the occupying power. All of those things are generating violence. Palestinians in Gaza are lashing out at the nearest Israeli target, the border town of Sderot, with crude but deadly rockets. In the Holy Land, with Jerusalem at its heart, great tectonic plates of religion, culture, and nationalism come together. It would be bad enough if only Palestinians and Israelis were affected. But this conflict reverberates across the world. Ignoring the legacy of 1967 is not an option.